All right, hello and welcome everybody. I did something similar to this when Oppenheimer came out, that Oppenheimer film, the Christopher Nolan one this summer. Talked a little bit about it sort of in relation to Bloodborne and these themes of like human potential and humanity's reaching too far for things as far as like technological advancements go and stuff like that. And I want to do something similar for Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon. This movie came out a couple of weeks ago, and I just saw it yesterday in theaters. And I think these two movies are kind of similar. They both deal with these like stereotypes of American history. With Oppenheimer, it was about World War II America and sort of deconstructing the myths around that era and examining what it means that we have all of these nukes now, right? But with Killers of the Flower Moon, it's more like taking a critical look at these stereotypes and myths that we have around cowboys and the American West and Westerns. Because this movie is a Western, but it's not like a John Wayne film or something like that. It is much more critical of American history and specifically the enclosure of the West and the stripping of land and property from Native Americans in the beginning of the 20th century. So if you don't know, some quick context for the movie is that it's based on a book by a man named David Grann, who's a historian and a writer, and it's based on a true story. Basically, the setup for the story is that the Osage people, Native Americans, spent like the last half of the 19th century, and really since like Europeans got to where they were living, but mainly the last half of the 19th century, just kind of getting pushed out of their land and moved to different places. They were from Kansas and Missouri, kind of in the Midwest, places like that. But eventually the U.S. government was like, okay, you can just have this shitty land in Oklahoma, and that's where you're going to stay, and that's it. And you can just have this stuff while we take all the other stuff and sell it off to people. But there was oil on the land. And for a brief period in history, the Osage people's ownership of that land made them the wealthiest people on the planet per capita. So it was a small-ish group of people, but they were richer, if you were measuring it per capita, than any other group of people on the planet at that time. So obviously that simply cannot do. We cannot have these Native Americans being so rich and telling white people what to do and owning property. My goodness, what a nightmare. So a bunch of these local white guys conspired over decades throughout the 1910s and 20s and into the 30s. They conspired to marry into these native families and then kill off the landholders so that they could get head rights. They would own the oil land. This represents a very interesting and tragic inversion of what you would typically see, which is, specifically like women trying to marry into families with men who had money all throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the Enlightenment. I mean, this is a common story that you hear, right? Because people need resources, and one of the main ways that resources and capital and property flowed was through marriage. But with the Osage, a lot of this property was passed down through women. Women were the landowners, women were the heads of their households. And so you have this guy named Ernest Burkhart. The movie focuses on a smaller section of the book. The book covers a ton of content. It's about the beginning of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This was one of the first cases that the FBI investigated. And it's about all of these, murders that took place over decades. But the movie focuses on this guy named Ernest Burkhart, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. He is a World War I veteran, which is already kind of weird. Like, What kind of American was going to go fight in World War I? Like, what are you doing over there, man? It has nothing to do with you. That's not really important to the review. I just thought that was funny that he was a World War I American veteran, because you don't see too many of those. But anyways, he's a World War I veteran, and he marries into a wealthy Osage family. He marries a woman named Molly, because his uncle not necessarily orders him to do it, but strongly encourages him to do it. And his uncle is a guy named Bill Hale, King Bill Hale, the king of the Osage Hills. He is a white man who owns a cattle ranch there, and he's kind of a, like, you know, he's a guy who can get things done, right? He's a businessman. He knows everybody. He's built hospitals and schools and stuff like that. He's pretty well liked in the community. And so Ernest, played by Leo, goes to go live with him, and Bill is played by Robert De Niro in a incredible performance. All the performances in this movie are fantastic, but especially their dynamic. And he marries into this family. And after he marries into this family, his uncle basically gets him to conspire to murder other members of Molly's family, his own family now, because he is married to these people, so that no one else has a claim to Molly's family's oil land except for Ernest and Bill. And one of the striking things in this movie for me was it really shows you that these guys stealing this land and murdering these people are not geniuses. They are just mean, dumb, selfish assholes. Like, there's no other way to describe it. Pardon my French, but like, these guys are just, they're stupid, right? And most of them crumble and rat each other out the second there is any pressure, the second they're not in complete control of the situation. You know, it takes the FBI, once they come down there, right, it takes an entire group of Osage people going to Washington, D.C. in the 20s, I think, and telling the president, like, we are being murdered. People are killing us and taking the land that belongs to us, and we're being pushed off of this land and killed for it. So eventually the FBI comes down and investigates, and within the span of like a couple of months, they get all of these guys to snitch on each other. There is an incredible scene at the end of the movie, which, spoilers, you know, these guys get caught. It's not necessarily a happy ending, though, which is, you know, we'll get into that. But there's this incredible scene between Ernest and this guy named Blackie. I don't know who the actor is who played him, but the guy's name in the movie is Blackie. He's kind of this small-time crook, a criminal, and his story is basically that Leonardo DiCaprio hires him in the middle of the movie to murder his brother-in-law, and the plan does not go off without a hitch, because they also have this weird little side scheme where Blackie is going to steal Ernest's car, and then Ernest will cash in the insurance money for it, and then Blackie gets to keep the car. It's like, literally, if you've ever lived in a small town, you know guys like this, who are just always doing these little weird schemes that are supposed to make them rich, but it just gets them into a bunch of trouble and everything falls in on itself. So this guy goes to jail for stealing Ernest's car, which Ernest told him to steal. And so he's mad at Ernest, right? And he also knows that Ernest is looking for someone to murder his brother-in-law and his sister-in-law. And so at the end of the movie, there's this scene where both of them are in this interrogation room and they're talking to each other, and Ernest is like, you need to tell me what you told them. And Blackie's like, I told them everything. Like, I told them everything that you told me. I told them that you wanted to kill members of your family. I told them about the whole thing. And Ernest is like, why would you do that? You know, why would you rat me out? Why would you snitch on me? And Blackie says something like, well, you owed me $20 and you only gave me $1. Like, that's the level that we're talking about here, is these guys just squabbling over a $20 payout of something that happened years ago. They're petty. They are petty and dumb and mean, but they think that they're smart. And there's this popular myth in America that if you grew up in America, you know about this, that westward expansion right? Taking over the West, manifest destiny, all of that stuff that happened throughout the 19th century was done by these brave pioneers, real self-sufficient guys. They're rugged cowboys. But this movie is about the closure of the West. Really, by like 1890, the West was pretty much done. There was no more West, right? These places all had towns and cities and roads and electricity and telegraphs and all this kind of stuff. The 1890 World's Fair in Chicago is oftentimes seen as like, well, the West is done, right? We've taken over all of the West, except for these lands that were held by Native Americans. And I think kind of the point here that Scorsese is underlining time and time again is that this westward expansion, this closure of the West, was not being done by geniuses or smart or brave people. It was being done by just these like dumb, selfish guys, right? This is how we got the world that we have today. This is how the world that surrounds us, especially in America, was built. It was not built by titans of industry and guys with vision for the future. It was a bunch of petty crooks who were okay with doing violence and murdering other people in order to get what they personally wanted. And the violence in the movie is shot in such a like frank and dispassionate way. There's this shot that I'm still thinking of in the movie where a woman is murdered by a guy who just kind of leans out of his window and shoots her, right? And it's just a steady shot on a tripod. It's like this is just like loading a truck for these guys or picking up groceries or something like that. They just don't think about it. And even in the end of the movie, when they're on the stand and all these guys are on trial, it's the big justice moment. One of the prosecutors is interviewing this guy who actually pulled the trigger and killed Molly's sister, and he's just asking like, so tell me how you did it, like walk me through how you murdered her. And I don't know who the actor is, but he does a phenomenal job. He just just has this creepy looking face. I know that's kind of mean, but he's just a very strange and scary looking man, but his face is totally blank and totally emotionless while he is answering these questions and just walking the prosecutor through how he murdered an innocent woman. And I think this is kind of a line that runs through a lot of Scorsese's movies. Think about stuff like Goodfellas, stuff like Casino, right? Those classics, the ones that everybody's seen. These guys, whether they're gangsters or cowboys or whatever it is, they are not these mythic, untouchable figures. They accrued a lot of power and a lot of influence. They hurt a lot of people. They made a lot of money, but a lot of them were just idiots who managed to not get caught for a long time. Or they weren't being caught because the police, the government, whoever it was that was responsible for bringing these people to justice actually didn't really want to do that. They weren't all that interested in getting involved in this. There's a long history that a lot of people have talked about the close relationship between the American mafia and intelligence agencies like the CIA, right? And that's kind of a whole other rabbit trail, but basically, like, America was built by guys like this. Guys who were just dumb and mean and racist and selfish. And Bill, Ernest's uncle, has this really chilling speech at the end of the movie when they're both in prison. Ernest is going to testify against him after flip-flopping like 3 times, I think. He's like, I'm going to confess, and then he tells the FBI, I'm not going to confess, and then he does, and then he doesn't. He's such an annoying character, like incredibly obnoxious man. But anyways, he's finally going to do it, and his uncle is like, you're going to go to jail forever, and for what? People are going to forget about this. It doesn't matter. Just give it a few years. Nobody's even going to remember these murders. It doesn't matter. You're going to tear your family apart, but at the end of the day, people are just going to forget about it and move on. And so you might as well not snitch and not testify and you can just keep your family together and everything will be pretty much the same. And the scary thing about that is that it is true. Like what Bill is saying in that scene is a reflection of the history from that point until this book got published. Basically, like, no one except the people who were directly involved in this really cared or were talking about these murders. It was not common knowledge. And even these guys, right, eventually they got out of prison. They were sentenced to like life in prison, and then eventually they got out, and I think Ernest lived in a trailer park with his brother until he died. I don't know when he died. Maybe like in the 80s or something like that, or the 70s would probably be more likely. And then Bill, right, he got out. They told him, like, never come back to Oklahoma. You're not allowed to come back here ever. But he came back. He visited family. He was doing business. It's like these guys really, at the end of the day, how do you even get justice for something like this? For the, like, coordinated conspiracy to murder somebody's entire family to get their land and their property. Just these guys going to jail doesn't bring people back to life. It doesn't give the land back to them. It doesn't restore anything at all. And so until this book was written, yeah, a lot of people weren't talking about what was going on or what had happened. And in Molly Burkhart's obituary, she passed away in the 1930s, I think. She had diabetes, which is another thing that this movie kind of explores, is like the early methods of treatment that people were trying to use to treat diabetes. A lot of Osage people at that time had diabetes. They were dying of diabetes. Molly gets insulin, but she's like one of the first people in the world to get insulin. It was a very new type of medication at the time. But in her obituary, there's no mention that her two sisters had been murdered by her husband and her brother-in-law. Like, just wasn't brought up, just wasn't mentioned. And another thing that sort of Bill keeps repeating in this movie is that the Osage love me, right? He says, I brought them into the grand 20th century. And he keeps saying how the Osage are dying, they're sickly, their time is up, they need to just give their land up because history is moving on without them. And it just sort of goes to show how Bill thinks of history and how a lot of people think of history. It's just something that happens, right? The Osage, Native Americans in general, they had their time, and now it's over, right? But rather than admitting that history is something that people make, they might make it consciously or not, but it's made by human beings, and there's a material reason for why the Osage were dying off at the time. But Bill just assumes that history is kind of bending in his favor, and that justifies his actions, and that makes him a good man. So, Killers of the Flower Moon. Excellent movie. It is very exhausting and hard to watch. It's 3.5 hours long, so I get it if people are a little bit hesitant, but I would encourage everybody to go see it, especially if you have any kind of interest in American history or anything like that. This has been a banger year for historical movies about American history, so go check it out.